So first things first, we have to create a project inside of Maya. Down to the project window, create a new project. Always name your projects. In this case, I'm just going to go with something for the lesson that kind of works a little bit more straightforward for what we're doing in the class. We're working with the Mila materials, so that's pretty good. Kind of a specific way of naming things. We always have to set our projects to the main folder that we're working with. I'm creating the scene from scratch here, so I'm just going to create a sphere and create a plane, and I'm just going to scale them up to fit, get the sphere right on top of the plane. Pretty simple. Now you might have more complex objects. That's the way that we should be doing it, with a more complex object. Again, this is just for lessons. You're going to want to clean up your scenes as you work. So think about naming your things. I didn't name it just yet, but I believe I go back and name these. I created a basic light, so a directional light to bring it in for the shadows, I believe. I'm working on the shadow pass first, so it doesn't really matter which one that I create first. It's the shadow pass or the actual other passes. And this is for an example of separating these things with the thought of compositing them later. So in my channel box, I can see that I have my polysphere, and I just moved it up a bit. I'm now changing from the display layers to the render layers, and I'm taking the three objects that I have and I'm going to put them into one layer. And that layer is going to be the layer for the shadow, where I'm going to just simply create the shadow that's going to go out into the composite. So I have a shadow render layer, and to work with the shadow, or to get it come across, I'm going to create a new material. So what I'm doing is right clicking, and I'm going down to assign new material, and I'm going to try to get this to be on screen, so I'll go up a little higher, down to assign new material. And I want to create the use background. You can do this with the surface shader, and you can get tricky with some of the other materials inside of Maya, but we're just going to use this. I take the layer, the render layer that is for the shadow, and under the render stats, I'm going to turn off what I don't need. So basically, I don't need the floor to cast shadows or have motion blur or have smooth shading on it, because I'm not going to smooth shade this. I don't need it to be visible in refractions or reflections, because again, it's just a shadow pass. In my shadow render layer, I bring up the settings. Now this is going to be for the render layer that is the shadow render layer itself, and not for the other ones. So I have a master layer and I have a shadow layer, and I come up here to work with mental ray. And for my scene section, the scene tab here, I'll be making a few little bit of edits. And right now it's just a basic test render to see what's going on here. And you'll see that my sphere has its visibility still on. So I need to remedy that, because you're seeing a couple things like in reflections and stuff going on. And also the sphere's visibility in the actual render, which I don't need. But I can still have this thing cast shadows. So I want it to cast shadows. So I don't need it to receive shadows. I don't need to have motion blur. Primary visibility I'm turning off. Smooth shading I have on, because I did hit 3 on my keyboard to smooth shade this. As I do a test render, you're going to see that I am looking at the alpha channel in order to see what is going to come out. Okay, so the only thing that renders out right now should be the shadow. I go to my rendering tab, or rendering menu, and under my render menu set, it's going to be based off of my render settings. So in my channel box, if I open up my render options here in my render settings, I can actually say that I want it to be an EXR, and I'm going to go with no compression this time. And remember, we're talking about the EXR being the all-encompassing file. We always want it to be name.number.extension. That's one of the things that Maya is familiar with, and other programs take it, especially Nuke, since we're working in Nuke. I'm only doing one frame, so my end frame I'm going to put to 1. So I have a start frame of 1 and an end frame of 1. My renderable camera right now is my perspective camera. It would be camera 1, or I can label a camera, make a new camera, label it, and call it shot cam, something like that. My quality is not super high, but it's of a production value, like 0.6 is a simple production value. Nothing huge. I'm going to go to render, down to batch render, and I get my little warning there. I'm rendering with mental ray, so the process is going to start here soon. And I'll see a percentage down there, and then when the percentage is done, then I'll be able to go check my render. So as I wait for that, I'm just going to let this play, because it's not very long. And usually it's a little bit faster, but I'm running kind of a lot of things on my computer right now. So that's 100% done, and it's just going to be the shadow render layer that comes out. And you guys are going to see that there's a folder that is created in our images folder of the project folder, and that's going to contain my passes. Okay, so when I have this open under images, you'll see that I have a shadow folder that will contain all of the render layers, basically from the shadow layer that would come out from there. And I only did the one render, so that's not a big deal. You'll see that I didn't have a name for this thing, so it kind of just gave me a default name. But I can call it specifically shadow, or whatever makes sense to you for the project. I'll batch render this again. In this case, I could really just go rename the other one. But I'll batch render it again just to show you that with the proper name in there, I'll be able to have it named for me correctly, especially if I have a lot of things going on in my scene. So I'll just let this play through again because, again, it's not too long. Close out my other stuff. And there we go. So if I take this and I go back to the folder, you see untitled and shadow. I can get rid of the untitled because I don't really need it. And the shadow is the same pass, it just has the awesome name shadow.001. 0001. So if I took it into a program like After Effects, I can do the same thing in Nuke to where I can composite it. I don't have to worry about these other layers because I was doing just a test project with which to show you guys in class and such. And I'll bring this render that I just created on over. So I need to go to the proper folder. And I'm going to get that EXR in here, which is just the shadow. And I'll drag it into After Effects, and you'll see that After Effects recognizes that I have an alpha channel on there and applies it. So that would be the only thing that rendered out from here, and that's the only thing that I would need to composite. So all of my other stuff would go on top of it, so the renders of the sphere, or the ball in that case, would go on top of this shadow, and then I can add something like a blur to say if I didn't have a really hot spot or a really hard light on this object that I wouldn't have such a hard shadow, I can go inside of After Effects and deal with the shadow, the blurring of the shadow. And that's the cool thing about render layers, is that I do have that option with which to work with separate layers instead of going back to Maya each time and spending a lot of time rendering these things out. Now this is a simple shadow pass, so it didn't take long to render out, but I wouldn't want to go back to Maya and have to deal with this when I can add a special effect in After Effects and just have that on there where I could dial in settings and change it on the fly. So if I had an art director or something come up to me, a client, saying this is not really what I want, can you do this to this, or specific instructions, then I could play with it a little bit as I'm doing with this shadow here. Make it a little fuzzy so that it's not such a hard shadow. I can change the opacity and different things like that inside of a program such as After Effects and Nuke in order to get the look, achieve the look that I want in the minimal amount of time and be able to change it on the fly without having to render for, minutes, hours, days, depending on how intricate my scene is and how much objects and how much I have going into these.